about over 1,000 people coming on a Saturday. It was too big, we got kicked out. And now it's the waterfront, and there are between 9,000 and 12,000 people on a weekend that go to that. It got too big for us, and we spun it out and sold it off at the end of 2017. So we've got a very close relationship, but it's run independently as a private company. That's what it looked like when it started after a few months. And that's what it looks like now. It's a 3,000 square meter site, and it's actually moving at the waterfront across the traffic circle by the end of this year, because they're going to build this site.
Hold on. Where are you moving?
It's just moving diagonally opposite the traffic circle. So still at the waterfront,
Yeah.
but another site, because they're developing this site. And as this site is developed, there will be a permanent home for the market there.
Okay.
So they're going to build a custom facility. We also, as mentioned, started the food dialogues back in 2014. Next year will be our 10 years. And that is our opportunity to kind of take the big picture, look at the food system. And our focus is on holding the complexity and the diversity of voices involved in the food system. So we have workshops, we have conferences, we have long table meals, we have walking tours, art exhibitions, all manner of ways that people can engage with the food system. So we do the deep dive with what I call the food systems nerds, who talk about food systems, and then we have other people who think about food as a meal or cooking or shopping or hunger. So we had an exhibition in an art gallery in Langa. We had musical performances. We had very interesting culinary experiences. This year, we reached about 50 million people through media. We had not quite 500 people in the room for various events. So it's become quite a thing. A 2-week program next year will be from the 22nd of July for the following 2 weeks. So to the 3rd of August, we can talk more about that. So just to give you a sense of the breadth of some of what we do, these are the 17, I think, partners who have helped us make this happen this year. And then most recently, we started an organization called Grow SA, and it is a leadership, mentorship development program that identifies people in communities where we're already working, who with a bit of a boost could really round out their skill set, their social capital and networks, and kind of elevate their ability to be what we call catalytic people in catalytic projects. So this year we have 11 people in a cohort. It's our 3rd cohort. And kind of building a network and a container of these kind of mostly young community leaders in vulnerable communities. And then finally, for the first time, we're involved in a big international grant-funded project called Afri Food Links, which I hate the name of, but we are one of 26 organizations working across 65 cities in Africa, 60 cities in Africa, 5 in Europe. 5 hub cities, Cape Town being one of them. So we're involved in Kisumu and Kenya and Mbale and Tunis and Ouagadougou. And that is about urban food environments. So we have funding to work on built infrastructure. We're incubating businesses that have youth and women leaders and a circular business model, strengthening multi-stakeholder governance platforms, research. So that's a EU Horizon grant. That is a research and innovation focused grant. And our role in Cape Town is really on the ground implementation as we work in communities. So most of the others are city officials, kind of academics, and we round that out along with Oridi, that's a local incubator that works a lot in the food system. So we're kind of the doers of the team. So for us, that's new territory, and we're not quite a year into that. So I wanted to share that to give you a sense of the breadth, the range of what we do working across the food system. And I want to talk about the challenge that we have identified in this work that I'll speak about then with Agrihubs. And growing out of this particular experience in Oranizept, we recognized what the power of community food gardens could be and started to work with partners in other communities to see if our experience might be relevant where they are. Knowing that it was hard enough to start one where you live, the idea of going out and starting one in someone else's community is impossible, but maybe we knew some things that could help where people were already doing this stuff. So that's the approach we took. And here's the Lenticure Psychiatric Hospital, the market garden that's there that was started for therapeutic benefits. Back in 2013, we raised R1.5 million for them for infrastructure and other things in 2016, and helped with kind of job descriptions and business planning and production planning and cash flow, and helped them get that running. This is a site of a primary school in Vredehuk, and working with the Kulisa NGO and their Streetscapes project to help people get back on their feet. Homeless residents in the City Bowl area of Cape Town, in Lavender Hill, primary school there. the Kanisa Garden, which is a Rastafarian community garden in Langa, that unfortunately burned a while ago. Informal farming in Dunoon. So across different kinds of communities, sizes, shapes, approaches, but always this community food garden, so not individual household gardens, not subsistence farming just for eating, and not commercial, although there may be commercially minded, not a formal business. So that's kind of the space that we found that we could play in well. And that's another one in Langa, one in Philippi Village here, and talking with a lot of farmers over years. And what we identified is that there are typically a common set of these activities on what we call social farms. So the language is always a bit weird. Is it urban agriculture? Is it farming? Is it food gardening? Are they social farm? So there's not consistent nomenclature. And so I apologize, sometimes I jump a bit in this. But here's to say it's not subsistence and it's not overtly commercial. So there is money and people do eat it, but it's something else. And what people do is they work collectively to harvest food, to grow the food, to plan what they're going to do. They have to bring members in and keep them. They have to have some sort of programs, even if it's just who's coming this week and who's coming next week and who's pulling the nettles and whatever. And they have to maintain the site. So these are kind of very basic, sort of universal activities. And we had also identified a set of impacts, but mapping the one to the other, what's happened here, is really the challenge. Yeah, no, please. So with the impact, we see the consistent ones, but like cause and effect is very difficult, because how does like communal harvesting lead to some sort of beneficial outcome, specifically multiple things lead to multiple outcomes. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Looks like we've
Frozen. Is everything frozen or just the presentation?
I think it's my laptop that's frozen.
Sorry, we're having a bit of a moment with the presentation.
Yes.
Oh, no.
Might be the weather.
Load shedding.
So I can carry on just talking while we get the tech going, if people can still hear me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I tried.
And so what we try to do is understand what the connections are between what we see people doing and what we see the outcomes being, because we see beneficial outcomes. We want to help people focus on what leads to those. And if there are negative consequences, what are the kinds of things to avoid? So each community is different, its context, its issues. You know, in Oranjezet, it's primarily single dwelling residential, fairly affluent people. Food insecurity is not really an issue there. People live behind walls and wires and spikes. They live in fear. There's social atomization. They don't always know their neighbors and so on. There's high levels of resource consumption and waste generation and all that sort of stuff. Very different to Langa, very different to Dunoon, but still there are issues in each community that somehow the community food gardens are helping them respond to. And so we went down a path of exploring with different kind of academic partners and others ways that these community food gardens play roles. So we worked with people who are kind of urbanists and town planners around the spatial elements of the way that these spaces affect the well-being of communities and the people who are involved. We worked with others on ways of localizing SDGs in communities as well. We are currently working on a project with partners in Australia and elsewhere on these as nodes for mitigating shocks and stresses linked to the climate crisis, but also other kinds of crises. So how are these nodes of resilience within communities? So trying to work with people to help us understand through different lenses what's going on here. And that led us to set of what we call design principles or underlying principles with this that I won't get into. But we went through this long process of unpacking kind of a logical framework of how these activities lead to these outcomes and what are the indicators and so on, and how do they link to the SDG. So we did a deep dive with sort of academic analysis a number of years ago, really to make sure that we were understanding, you know, what the difference could be if one applied resources to make this happen. Because in vulnerable communities, what you don't want to do is treat people as instrumental, as guinea pigs, and they have the least amount of resilience to negative outcomes. So really being quite cautious as we move forward, and having taken time to build trust in communities where we had been working, for example, in Langa for 5 or 6 years now, primarily with in Mitchell's Plain with the Lensahur market garden in that community, also now it's 7 years or more. And so we started to ask ourselves then, given what the issues are facing community food gardens, what are the needs that they have? What are the challenges they're facing, and what are the kinds of things one could do to address those? So I've got a lovely slide in here that puts those up. But it's things like, how does one reduce the out-of-pocket costs for these food gardens? So again, using the example of Langa, it's a community of about 100,000 people. It's well circumscribed by apartheid spatial planning with railroad tracks and highways and golf courses and wastewater treatment facilities and an industrial area. So it's quite a constrained and circumscribed place. And when people need seedlings and compost and so on, come back to this. When people need seedlings and compost and so on, they have to leave. They go on their own. They go usually to the Abalimi Bezekaya Garden Center in Nyanga. They buy their seedlings. They buy their compost. They're usually going in a minibus taxi, so they can only carry what they can have on their lap. Carrying compost in a taxi is not going to make you friends anyway. So you buy 3 bags when you need 3 cubic meters, and you buy however many seedlings you can afford. And so it's expensive. It's time consuming. And what we found is that that's one area of opportunity. So I'm going to skip some of this kind of stuff around issues and framing solutions. I talked about these projects we're doing in publications. So, so if we can help, sorry, we're not catching up yet. Slide on the screen. We'll catch up to the slide on the. So we also see that farmers can get better at farming if they want to by having training and knowledge exchanges that they can sell when they need to. So helping with harvest support and market access, that getting farmers to know one another for support during shocks and stresses. So during the taxi strikes, for example, word of mouth, what's going on, how do we get food? They've got a network they belong to and can turn to for resources. They can work at a local scale, so the affinity of community involvement, and prioritizing farmer needs without judgment. So sometimes farmers are growing because they want to eat, sometimes they want to sell. But what we found is there's quite a broad range of motivations. We have traditional healers who are trying to strengthen their healing practice. We have people who want safe spaces to be with their kids. We have nature lovers who want beautiful green spaces. People who are elderly getting away from the heat in the summer and wanting to have a cool green place to be that has water. So all these motivations are mixed in these community food gardens. It's not just a commercial motivation. So that's where Agrihubs come in, and that's the long version of getting to what these are. So we worked from a definition that comes from something that came out of the SA Food Labs workshop that was helping with the provincial government's Nourish to Flourish strategy. So Agrihubs are basically take the notion of an agricultural cooperative and focus on the production side, helping the growers grow. It's an overlap then with something called a food hub. So that's the language that exists. That's what we've picked up. We didn't invent it, and we want to fit in with it. So it's a bit awkward, but rather this than new jargon. So an Agrihub and a food hub overlap. Sometimes the terminology is exchanged, but we're focused on supporting the growers. So if one thinks about community resilience from these sites, there's already commercial activity. The farmers are already buying and selling things. And so by having a collective of people who have an economic incentive to work together, we find that there's a stable foundation for all the rest of the things. So that's really why the production side is our focus. And we hope that over time, more of the food hub side we can turn to, but that's not where our primary activity is at the moment. So this is not a bad diagram for understanding how we see Agrihubs in between the urban social agriculture, the community farms on the left, helping with market access, helping supply collective, buying power for these inputs and the support, and then supplying into the local food economy, fresh produce, and taking in organic waste. So that's an idealized situation, kind of how one envisions where the Agrihubs sit at a community scale. And there are a number of objectives we focus on that are specific to the Agrihubs. I'm obsessed about this, but this is how then our M&E on all of this works. It's about economic opportunities. It's about opportunities for the farmers, for the community, and so on. So we can come back to this if there are questions. So we have established 3 agri-hubs. I've talked about Langa. That's where it sits roughly in Cape Town. We've worked with local partners. When we started, we've been there for a number of years. We work with a local partner called the Masake Foundation. They're a nonprofit Langa-based and development nonprofit. And we had already had 21 food gardens that we've been working with. And we now work with 33 existing food gardens. We don't go out and start new ones. We don't even champion starting them because we know it's hard enough, even internally motivated. If you need me to come around and say, hey, start this, it's going to fail. That extrinsic motivation is not going to happen. So this green box is where within the community of Langa, the site is. And that, for those of you who know Langa, it's in the Heritage Precinct. It's near the Gugusatebe, it's kind of at the top left of that quadrant that's there. The beer hall's at the bottom, that's Laratoli Avenue. And it is strategically located fairly centrally within Langa. So anyone is within Langa is within a 20-minute walk of that site. So that's useful. You can walk with a wheelbarrow or a backpack or just walk on your own. Bicycle ride, it's about 6 to 8 minutes end to end. And come and get what you need or drop off what you have. And of course, with vehicles, it's even cheaper. So for Langa,
Get what you need or buy what you need.
so it depends on what the arrangement is. So when we get donations, it's get. When there aren't donations, it's buy. And I'll talk about that. So we work with the landscape architect to co-design what this site would look like, making sure that the needs of the farmers are foremost. And that's at the top is what the site looked like before we got involved with the design at the bottom. And there's a new kind of aerial view where one can see some of the beds have been changed, and we have prepared the ground for the construction that was coming. And there's certain common infrastructure. You need storage, you need administrative space. There needs to be some area for loading and bulk inputs and that sort of a thing. So each site has a slightly different layout, but these elements are more or less the same. We designed a set of structures, having experienced the frustrations of other kind of prefabricated temporary structures. So shipping containers are hell, they're expensive and difficult to work with. And so these are built in a modular sections. Each panel can be carried by 2 ordinary people. You can put it in the back of a bucky. You don't need a special crane to move things around. You can adapt a panel and put a window in it or a door, swap it out. So we've got a number of these that are built on site at Langa, and we'll see some of that as well. So trying to solve additional problems as well as we go. So this is some video, and I don't know if it's going to play well or if we can hear it. I don't know if this is going to work with the Teams group. Someone give us a thumbs down or a message in the chat if you guys can hear or see this. Okay, thank you, Clifford. So moving swiftly on, just hoping to get the voices of the farmers in, but the tech setup isn't going to do that. So in Mitchell's Plain, there you can see where it's located. Mitchell's Plain is nowhere near as clearly delineated by boundaries. So the area outlined in red is roughly where we're talking about. So that's Lenticure, Portland's, Rocklands area. Khayelitsha is there off to the right on that map. That's the N2 is the major road going from the upper left across to the middle right. And the site at the Lenticure Market Garden is the box view. And that is about a 1.6 hectare site. Used to be a cricket oval that was disused for years and years. And so while you see more mature kind of farming activity, it's the same kind of infrastructure. The shade house and tunnel, office space, storage, loading bay, space for bulk inputs, that kind of thing.
What's the total area?
It's the whole green area there is 1.6 hectares. So again, this is a farm that is established for the therapeutic benefit of the forensic patients at the psychiatric hospital, but it's run in its other aspects on commercial principles so that it can pay to keep itself running for the therapeutic benefit. And it never quite gets there. It loses money every month, but it's closer. So it's a pretty good indicator of sort of a 1.5 hectare urban farm run on commercial principles. But this is a bit different than the community food gardens because most of those aren't run on commercial principles. So anyway, it's the context of the community we're working in. That's what it looks like with Tony there as the main farmer, the production manager, That's what the pack shed facilities look like. And it's a model for the kind of thing that we're working on establishing, smaller and a bit more flexible in Langa, and I'll get to that in Kailicha. But this is the kind of thing: overhead shade cloth, overhead water, drying screens, stainless steel, so all the hygiene and the standards, cold storage at the back, and so on, and other visits as well, what the shade house looks like. So those are the kind of spaces that are there. These are, I think, 16 of the 19 growing sites that we work with in Mitchell's Plain. Very different from Langa. The sites are bigger, the houses and the properties are larger, they're more formal, they're farther apart. People can't really walk. The pattern of safety is quite different. There's a lot more social fragmentation and distrust across parts of Mitchell's Plain. So the social dynamics and the spatial dynamics are quite different. Bigger growing sites, primarily at schools, is what we're talking about there, which is quite interesting. Again, a video that I can't show you, so my apologies, and I'll move on. And touching on the third one there in Kailicha, this is not in Town 2, sorry, that's a mistake, it's in Makaya, which is between Town 2 and Makaza. Yeah. So this is the site. It is on what's called the Skaga line. So Skaga is the Siazama Community Allotment Garden Association. It was established in 1997 and is supported by Abalimi Bezekaya. There are 5 big blocks under the Eskom power lines there. And the location that we're looking at is Skaga 1. Which is the first one, and so you can kind of see where the lines run there from lower left to upper right, opposite one of the technical high schools there. And Naga 1 has allowed for one corner, one allotment to be made available for the infrastructure for the Agrihub, and it will have the same kind of infrastructure. There's some existing rundown infrastructure that we will upgrade that already exists at Skaga. And there's a very good partnership between a collective of what started as 51 more commercially minded but still informal farmers who used to be serviced by PEDI. When PEDI stopped working with informal farmers, some of you are smiling in the room, you know the story. The farmers stayed together and they approached Abalimi and said, can you help us sell? And Abalimi said, we'll do what we can. You can use the brand that we used to use to sell into the market called Harvest of Hope. So they've associated themselves as the Harvest of Hope farmers. They started a formal legal entity, a voluntary association. They opened a bank account. And so they're the most commercially minded and formal of the groups. There are now 83 food gardens since we got involved with them in January. And we've gone through a process of co-design with them. So this is what some of that derelict existing infrastructure looks like. But they've got water, they have storage, they have very strong network of farmers. And Skaga has been allowing these farmers to use their boma basically as their pack shed. So it's minimally functional, but it's kept them going. And we have worked with landscape architects and then with the architect school C, School for Exploratory Architecture, which is an amazing UCT affiliated but independent nonprofit school of architecture, with the students to kind of unpack with the farmers what their needs are, how that might work spatially and structurally and so on. So that's been really interesting. And these are the designs that have come up. So again, temporary structures. It's hard to really see, but in the big gray box, if you look in the bigger diagram in the upper right, the big gray box has an outline that is of kind of sort of shipping container equivalents. So there are a number of different structures, a kitchen and pack sheds, and there's a central kind of covered wash pack meeting area. And there are demonstration gardens that are for seed production and collection. So teaching people how to grow for seed and save that. There's kind of runoff water reused with some trees. There's parking bays and also some laundry facilities, because one of the big things that keeps predominantly the women from being as present on their growing sites is they have other family obligations. So a small community kitchen where they can cook things and then use wonder bags for passive cooking, so they can then go home with a meal. They can stay and do their laundry and hang things out. All the sorts of things that are helping them spend more time in their growing space is part of what they've identified is really important to them. So that's the kind of responsiveness that an Agrihub needs to provide to its community food gardens. All right, so moving on, that's another video that we're not going to watch. So how it works. Existing community food gardens, we facilitate them coming together if they're not already in a network. We place the farmers at the center of the network and minimize any dependency on us as an outside organization. We always work with a local partner that already exists, knows the community based in the community, has aligned principles, and what we do aligns with what their vision is for their work in their community. So it's the Masake Foundation in Langa, it's the Spring Foundation in Lenticure, and an organization called Jacob's Garden. And then it's Abalimi Bezakaya, along with Harvest of Hope. Skaga isn't really a separate legal entity, even though they've been around forever, but they have a collective and a governing body. So with the bulk purchasing power of this collective of farmers, they will save on average 80% of their input costs, rather than going to, even with Abalimi running as a nonprofit, on average 80% of their input costs. That's not counting the donated seeds and seedlings and compost and manure and things that we can get. So there's already a major economic incentive. They get 5 times as much for the same money they're already spending. I mean, anyone who knows that is already in. They're already highly motivated to be part of the buying network. We also do workshops and training to match the needs of the farmer. So we don't compete with what Abalimi does or Seed or any of the existing programs, but quite responsive to specific challenges. So doing cob construction, for example, and we found that a lot of the women were not feeling comfortable learning to use power tools or other things because it was framed as building structures, it was construction work. But when we talked about other kinds of building, for fires, for warmth, for other kinds of things, we found that they were quite keen. So they were learning the same skills and they came out knowing how to use circular saws and drills and so on. But the framing of it was something that suited the way that they were willing to engage with the content. So that kind of approach is very effective. And then we can have, for example, we get a donation of manure. Working with manure that hasn't been properly fully cured and so on in an urban context is very sensitive, shall we say. Smells and bugs and so on. So doing workshops when that manure is available, we will then work with the farmers to show them very quickly how to work with that in a way that makes it work, but avoids a lot of those challenges. So that's the kind of flexible training and extension services that we can provide, and then locating that knowledge within the existing network. So as the network builds, we try to identify who knows what across the network, and then center them as the facilitator or the expert. So again, we're not having to bring in again and again the experts from outside. So not walking away from it, but making sure that we're focused on the strength of the network and not the external dependency. And there are steering committees of various kinds across these networks that make the decisions about what are the needs of the farmers and which should be prioritized in terms of workshops, in terms of crop purchases and so on. So we facilitate that. We provide the venue, we make the coffee, we take the minutes and help them do more and more of that. So we now have minute taking done by the steering committee in Langa, which is fantastic. So action items and deadlines and so on. So they had their own AGM. They decided on the offices. They elected the people. They've got redundancy in the office bearers. They are switched on and they're running this. That's about 160 farmers represented by 9 people. So when there are questions, we go to the steering committee. What do you want us to do? We see this. Do you think it's something worth discussing? Do you have other priorities? So we will raise questions. We will challenge ideas, but ultimately it's their decision as to what's done and when and why and how. We do community awareness open days so people can find out what the heck is happening over there and how do we get involved and so on. We, like I said, always work with local partners. We have formal agreements. We host different kinds of harvest activities depending on what they need. This is one of what the farmers call a market day. A while ago, you could see the beautiful weather in Langa. So pop-up infrastructure before the buildings were constructed. We had gazebos, we had potable water, all the rest of it, and doing the weighing and taking the records. And it's quite a social activity. So the kids come out and wash, and there's food and celebration, and that kind of social cohesion is built in that way. And you can see who's got the best crops. So it's always Nonza Leseko is a genius farmer, and she's always most successful. People ask, what do you do? How does it work? So that kind of peer pressure is also quite helpful. And who got the most money on the day. We develop price lists for the farmers and for wholesale and for retail with the farmers, and we track that and have comparative pricing. And they get 2 to 3 times the price through the Agrihub of what they would get if they sold on their own. That's what it looks like. That was the most recent last week in Langa. So that's the BOMA that Skaga makes available for use there in the bottom left. And again, they weigh, they've got the book, everyone takes notes, everyone knows what they get. And then they use a baki to make deliveries on Monday and Tuesday. We also own a mobile cold room. So as they grow out of the baki and as we get out of winter and need that cold chain, that they can tow the trailer and maintain. There's a tool library, a lending library. So when farmers have things that they need but don't have, this is the farmers at Moya Waikaya that are borrowing from the Lenticure tool library. So some of the farmers affiliate to more than one AgriHub, which is fine. We're not judgy, but we have to make sure we don't double count. Because the farmers of Moya, I mean, they're epic, but there are a number of them and they're productive, and we don't want to double count their numbers. So they can check out a tool and use it and then check it back in. And if they need to keep it, no one else needs it, then they can keep it for a while. But having that shared stuff, and we'd like to have like walking tractors and other things to help as well. So we'll get there. And that's the mobile cold room. That is not our trailer on the bottom right, but we have one that's very similar to that. So we can help move things around. And to date, we've been working with about 8.5 million rand of funding. Combination of local grants, government, international grants. The big orange is an international grant from the Joint Development Committee. They are an American-Israeli-based philanthropic organization. They do a lot of work with Jewish communities around the world, but they also do work that has nothing to do with religion. And they are much more active in Africa now over the last couple of years. And we are the biggest grant recipient in South Africa to date. They're also working with other communities in other parts of South Africa. So diversified funding, and we're currently applying for the next cycle of funding. And for the next 3 years, we think we'll need about another 8 million rand or so, and I'll talk about the head. Successes, of course, I've talked about a fair amount of this. So farmers are getting 2 to 3 times their price and saving about 80% on their input costs. And they're seeing that the return on inputs is about 10 times. So what they pay for their inputs, not counting their labor, they don't pay rent, they usually don't pay for water, they don't pay for water. So they can see that what they put in, if they can wait 13 weeks or whatever the time frame is, they'll get that. And that's a big factor for people in vulnerable communities, because I've got cash now, I can use it now. If I'm waiting 3 months and I don't get a harvest and whatever, I'm taking risks that maybe my life doesn't allow me to take that. But if they can see you'll consistently have a market, then it's worth it for them. And that trust and confidence is a big part of their decision-making process. Sorry, these numbers are quite small, but this is as of last month, working with 644 farmers. The number on Khayelitsha is quite small, and that's because we don't have the actual details of each of the farmers. So we don't just count the numbers, we need to have a name and a unique, we have a name, a unique individual. And because we found that mobile phone numbers can represent multiple farmers, and farmers can have multiple phone numbers, and farmers can be affiliated to multiple sites. So that's why I always say about. We're north of 700 farmers, I know, but from the 83 food gardens in Khayelitsha, this represents about less than a third of them. So we'll get there. We're going out and visiting now with our team. We've got a service level agreement. We're paying the Harvest of Hope farmers to collect the data that we need. There's baseline data that goes into an air table that is farm size, cultivated area, border areas, condition, et cetera, contact people, number of farmers, age of farmers, gender. That's kind of foundational information. And then every month there's an update to more like activity data, seedlings, crops planted, harvest, all that kind of stuff. So you can see we're predominantly working with female farmers, Mitchell's Plain, a lot of younger farmers, a lot of women. That's schools linked, but also SEED is the permaculture training institute that's there. They've been around for 17 years. They've trained a lot of women in Mitchell's Plain in permaculture skills. And then in terms of harvest value comparison, we track kind of what the farmers who are selling are actually getting. What that doesn't represent is the farmers who are just selling to their neighbors and so on, who get a much lower price because they're really just trying to get rid of stuff that otherwise will go off if they want. We also have opportunities to link with other organizations in community. So I just want to talk about some of the other value of the AgriHubs. So as a node of infrastructure with water and that's safe and green and clean and has some knowledgeable people, it attracts interest from other like-minded organizations at a community scale. So we worked with the Langa ECD Forum. We visited all 41 ECDs in Langa, part of the forum, to assess their potential for growing their own food. We've helped connect them with obviously the AgriHub and know about the resources for that. As it turns out, there are only about 8 of them that are ready and another 8 that potentially could be ready. And they're working with service providers on putting some of those things in place. They're actually working with vertical hydroponic system, which is interesting, a recommendation, but that's where they're going. But just saying the AgriHub is a resource to the community, to other kinds of organizations. We supported the municipality's organic waste composting pilot, and they worked with primary schools and with informal food traders to take the food waste to a site, and we trained the farmers in composting methods and so on. But it really was a challenge because the city never could properly fence the site. So the compost was always contaminated. It was an illegal dumping site. But anyway, it was an opportunity for the city to have additional support where we could provide the technical knowledge that they couldn't, because on their staff in the solid waste management department, they don't directly do the composting. So it helped add value to programs that they could then take and identify what are the weaknesses and how to move on. Supporting community kitchens with food, working with informal traders. Here's a Malawian man who does great informal trade in Langa with the community. He's getting his supply from Epping, and that's Loose Corner there on the bottom, as well as Andrew Bahrain and a walking tour we did with the EDP and others a while ago. But just helping understand the flows of food coming in and out, and how the Agrihub could then take over some of that supply if it's essentially being imported from mainstream commercial farmers who are already commercially successful. And interesting, in Langa, there's a bicycle delivery service called Cloudy, which you can use with WhatsApp. And so the street trader here could WhatsApp Cloudy to go to the Agrihub to pick up potatoes, bananas, whatever might be there. We don't have either potatoes or bananas, just saying. Whatever might be there in cold storage. So if they run out, they can keep less exposed to the elements and have more kind of just-in-time delivery in that community. So those are the kinds of things that we're exploring, that local food economy. So we're not there yet, but the pieces are in place. And then other organizations get their own funding from the Department of Agriculture or others, and they have a network they can plug right into. If they don't currently have an existing food garden, but because of their mission, they want to create one, they don't have to stand alone. And they've got a knowledge network and resources. And so it just helps go farther with that kind of investment. And then, yeah, that's the one, that's Jacob's Garden in Mitchell's Plain. And then other community events. So going into the community hall in this one, again, in Langa, we're having an event on the 14th of September in Mitchell's Plain, talking about Agrihubs, what's going on, how you can get involved, how other community organizations might benefit. And then school visits. So kids seeing farmers doing interesting things, learning about seeds and seedlings and carrots don't come from Checkers or, whatever, all that stuff. And working with the school teachers. And then other NGOs. This is a project that Mensch did last year on Mandela Day, buying about 2,500 Rand worth of produce from the Langa farmers, and then having people come in on Mandela Day, chopping it up and making soup, and then having that soup go to the community kitchens to feed community members. And they fed over 4,000 residents at Langa on the day. So when people want to do these kind of wonderful activities, even if they're a once-off, it fits into a system and a structure that has ongoing benefits, which is important, because you can't always designate, look, guys, you're coming in, it's sort of seagull philanthropy. You fly and you poop all over everything and you fly out. And that's not really helpful, right? We want that to be connected to something that's a little more, sustaining. And then another one that kind of came out of nowhere was this rooftop farm on the Kenilworth Shopping Center. So the Mr. Price Foundation, other people were interested in doing this, and they needed someone who could actually run a farm. So we were working with an organization that had invented a vertical hydroponic growing system. This is called the African Grower. It's covered in beautiful shui skirts here. But these are 4 buckets that grow vertically and very water efficient, everything you would expect from a controlled environment hydroponic system. It's not certified organic, but it doesn't use a lot of nasty chemicals and pesticides. Actually, it uses no pesticides. But obviously the nutrients need to be dissolved in water. And so there are about 600 of these buckets in this. And so we were able to recruit and hire a farmer and manage this. And there are now 4 interns from Elsenburg who are working there for 2 years. And we have 2 interns a month from Langa who go there and also get training, and they come back and they have their own tower that they can grow with at home, and they fit into another sort of household food gardening program called Black City Farm that someone else runs. So all of these kind of connections start to happen because you've got a foundation and a network, and there's trust and certainty and transparency. So this is not at all what we were planning, but these are the kinds of things that come out when you start to create this sort of stability in a vulnerable community where other people want to try to make a difference. And that was the mayor and Alderman Foss kind of opening that facility about 10 months ago. So that's the good stuff. The challenges are many. So first of all, we're working in vulnerable communities where life is hard, right? The hustle is real and people to survive have a lot of things on their mind. And these are people who, through their food gardening, will never be able to feed their families and will never earn enough to change their material circumstances, right? That's very important. They will never earn enough to not still be vulnerable in their household circumstances. So it can enhance their livelihood, but it is not simply for the money. So it frees up cash, which is great, and everyone needs more cash. But frankly, they'd be better served if they could get a job. And often when people do get a job and they leave farming, we celebrate because they moved on. So that's part of why we don't motivate, go out and farm. You must have your own motivation because it's not going to change your material circumstances fundamentally. It does contribute to mental health. It contributes to all kinds of other issues. But so again, life is hard. We get disruptions from like the EPWP programs. So they come in, they've got 6 monthly stipends, and suddenly farmers aren't on their farms anymore. Things are derelict, weeds, theft, all kinds of stuff, but that's because they're offered in cash. When they come back 6 months later, even though their farm is nothing and they got to start all over, they had 6 months of cash, which was the better decision for them. So we've got to respect the complexities of the lived realities of these farmers. So for the agri-hubs, there are economic, sociocultural, environmental issues, and then operationally. So obviously financial sustainability, there's not a lot of money available. So while the agri-hub itself does have cash flowing through it, the steering committee must make a decision about how much of that needs to be retained to pay some of the operating costs, which right now we are subsidizing. Our vehicle, our time, our trailers, all of that stuff, but they see the cost of that and they understand that there's a process for them having to take on that cost. But as they see that it's worth it, then they're more willing to do it. So the Harvest of Hope farmers take 7%. And right now that's paying for their admin costs and what they need to do. And they will adjust that amount as they need to pay more bills. So we're able to subsidize that, but in time, financial sustainability. So we're making decisions like having solar PV spec'd with the infrastructure so the operating costs for having to pay for electricity is not there, and so on. So I talked about the short-term income opportunities, that's EPWP and so on. Diverse context, so Langa is not Mitchell's Plain, and the informal settlements in Langa are not the formal side of Langa, and everyone's got complex motivations. There's this thing called Expanding Horizons that an honors student did a study about the expectations of the farmers and agency and what they want to achieve. And when they first started kind of talking about farmer agency was something that wasn't even on their radar. And now that they see it, the conversation, the expectations have completely shifted. So as one approaches the horizon shifts, right? Because you see more, and that's something that one needs to account for. It adds to the complexity of our job, but it means that the potential that the farmers see in what they're part of expands, and that's good news, but it makes it complicated. And then environmentally, every site in Langa seems to have been an informal dumping site. There's rubble everywhere. Seasonality is extreme. Groundwater is an issue, the salinity of groundwater. Working with well points as opposed to boreholes is a whole other thing that most people don't understand. And then operationally, like logistics right now, market access, driving around to 700 farmers. You can't do that. How do people get things? How do you maintain the cold chain? Like we're being supported by a network of ECDs. There are 6 of them. We've got to deliver to each of these places in difficult places. We're not a logistics organization. So we're straddling the growing side. There's a need for a food hub. Where does that come from? Who plays that role, etc. So this is kind of where we are, but it's a good problem to have. It means that things are happening. All right, and then deeper issues. Urban food gardening is viewed as social development, right? It's about community development and health and mental well-being and physical well-being and all of that kind of stuff. But it's a bridge to economic development. So the farmers that do have potential, I was talking about Nonza Liseko and her farming. She's now a contract farmer. So that feeding scheme supporting the ECDs is contracted with her to grow. And so every month she's getting the seedlings she needs. So she's got it. She could be on a bigger piece of ground and she could be a commercial farmer. She's 1 or 2 or 3 out of 165 in Langa we work with, but that's great. But it's a bridge to this kind of thing, and it's not viewed as something that is worthy of economic development, attention, or investment. So within government and policy structures, it falls between the cracks a little bit. Also, these are all informal businesses, and it's an informal part of the food. It's part of the informal food system, and yet 60 to 70% of Cape Townians get their fresh produce from the informal system. So it's very different from their Woolies on the bottom and the formal system. They cannot sell into those big formal systems. So their customer base needs to be quite different. And expecting them to grow and have a cooperative that can meet all those hygiene, health, safety, record-keeping standards so they can be delivering to food lovers distribution center is just not going to happen. So it's building the customer value chain all the way through to the end consumer that's also part of the challenge. So models of formal systems don't really apply to what these farmers can do. And then that local agency and vision of farmers, it may be, like I was saying, that the needs of the farmers have nothing to do with farming. They need clothes washing machines. They need other kinds of things. So understanding that their vision for their community is something that has to be respected, and navigating where it's sufficiently divergent from what the AgriHub can and should do and starts to fall outside of what realistically that project should cover, and what it could cover is a negotiation. And we haven't found things that are outside, like training people and getting driver's licenses. Like, I think that would probably fall outside, but if they were driving the bucky, the logistics, like, so we can find ways of connecting these things, but it's understanding that that local agency and vision also changes and expands and differs by. So those are some of the challenges. Future potential, we're going to look over the next funding cycle to have something that can be shared with people in other communities so that any like-minded NGO might pick up some kind of how-to guide and be able to take this on themselves. We don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know whether they would have to affiliate somehow with the network, if they could just take it as open source and do their own thing. We're working all that stuff out, but there's a lot of insight here that may be valuable to others, and we want to share it. We just want to do it responsibly, knowing that if we say this leads to that, that there's data to back it up, and they know how to assess that for themselves. So that's really what the next cycle is. We expect to have funding to do a fourth AgriHub, which will be our first test of our existing methodology. So how do you identify partners? How do you identify a community? How do you put together a working partnership? How do you kind of design and plan? How do you implement? How do you operate? How do you assess? All those kinds of things. We'll test that. And then with that, we'll build some kind of, call it an investment case. But we need the kind of funding that can help the scale if it's going to scale. And that doesn't necessarily mean us going from 4 to 14 to 40 to 400. That's not our model. We want to be able to share the approach, and the learnings, and the templates, and find other partners in other cities in South Africa, around the world, wherever it is, who feel that this is valuable to them, and then what's the value of the broader network. So I think I have one more slide, and then who knows where that might go. I've kind of spoken to that. So I know I've talked for an hour, so how much time we have for questions and discussion? I just want to say that we are meeting on the 14th, all three of the AgriHubs for the first time. They're representing over 700 farmers. There will only be 100 people in the room, so we're not getting 700 people together. And we are having a presentation from another NGO called the Federation of the Urban and Rural Poor. They've been around, they're called Fed Up. They've been around for over 40 years. And they are very much coming from a collectivist approach. They do food saving schemes. They also run kind of little farming hubs in different communities, urban and rural. But we want them to come and share the stories of what the power of a collective might be. We want to help the farmers that we're working with recognize how a collective voice and this sort of leverage might be used for their own benefit. So not to push them into that, it's up to them. But they've got their collective at the community scale. We've got 3 AgriHubs in Cape Town so far. And what might that mean? So starting to, again, facilitate broadening of some horizons and for them to explore among themselves where they might take that. So one of the questions at the end of that will be, whether another conversation about the broader collective is worthwhile, is the timing right, and how to go about it. But we want to help them at least recognize the breadth and the power of what they're part of and what's becoming, and where that goes will be good. All right, I'm gonna take a breath. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. I know we're not slightly ahead of time, and I apologize for the technical glitches, but maybe we can take some questions for about 5 or so minutes.
I can stay, so it's up to whoever can stay, but
Okay,
we'll start
Thanks,
with that. That's fine.
Questions here or live?
And I was just wondering about what you think the role of research and academia is in kind of helping or, supporting this kind of work.
So, very important. We, in doing what we're doing, want to do the things that work. And there are multiple ways of assessing what works, and one is your lived experience of what works. But another is obviously data and other kinds of analyses of the work. And we are not the scholars and the researchers and so on. And if we're going to be audacious enough to say, if you do this in your community, you can expect the following kind of results, we better be able to say that credibly. And that's really where that kind of robust interrogation of what we do is so important to us. So part of that has been, I mentioned a number of book chapters and other studies that we've been part of, but the academics have been the leads, and thank God for that. We're also doing things like we got another batch, a small grant from the Global Risk Governance Program at UCT to work with the farmers on something that is starting to look at linking nutrition and income together for some of the farmers. So see through a targeted intervention that the nutritional intake of a food growing household improves. So we're going to do that in a way that's not a robust test, but we're looking for signals that it's positive enough that it's worth looking more deep. So we'll use like a photo voice methodology, so taking pictures of the plates of food in certain participating farmers' households, and then what can they grow that supplement, kind of diagnosed at a distance without any lab test or anything else, but by a qualified nutritionist, kind of what's likely to be a gap, and then helping them grow that and learn how to cook it in a way that's nutritious. So it's those kinds of things where we need to fit in. And then for us, the big test is that these community food gardens themselves, not the Agrihub, the food gardens, strengthen the resilience of the community. And by that, we mean they improve the well-being of the community. And during times of shock and stress, there is a faster either recovery or bounce forward from that. And we need to test that in a way that has credibility. And the way that we want to do that is through a pilot that fits with the framework of, in this case, what the city of Cape Town is doing. So they've got epidemiologist Natasha Berkowitz, who is working on kind of a public well-being assessment methodology dashboard, et cetera. So if you think of epidemiologically how something like COVID spread across the city, if you think about well-being, there could be places where you see the same kind of signal of waves or the spread of lack of well-being. And what being able to identify that and intervene is something that is of interest. And then also where there is well-being, what are the kind of things that might cause it? So you get scattered patterns, but when you see clearly epidemiological signals of change in well-being, the city wants to be able to identify and get involved. Be able to use similar kinds of framework of understanding how do you define well-being, how do you measure it, so that our results fit in and we can do comparisons to what they, so it's that kind of thing where we need the rigor, because we're on the ground. Our team, I'm the only one who's not a qualified farmer, right? We are not NGO types. And even our NGO types, who have like degrees in development studies, are also farmers. So we need the bigger thinkers and the people connected to the bigger patterns to help keep us honest and keep it rigorous, and then we get loads of people working on theses and research. We've had multiple master's theses written about some aspects of the work and all of that. You ask me a question, I'll talk for 10 minutes. I'm sorry. Exhausted everyone.
Just in terms of the value, or like the rand value of how much food is sold like per month, like do you have that? I don't know if that was on one of the slides, but
it was not. So it's not very much. And I don't have the slide, but we calculate kind of per participating farmer and per growing site and all of that. And that's one of the things that we track. But it's not one of the things that we, at one level, really care about.
Yeah.
Because many of the farmers are growing for multiple reasons. They grow for their own consumption. They grow feeding schemes. Some of the farmers who have permission to grow at schools have to give some or all of that food to the feeding scheme at the school. They grow at the sites of community gardens, kitchens. So while we definitely want to track it, and we care about that in terms, so what we track is the overall value that we expected from the seedlings that were made available through the Agrihub. So whether it's bought or donated, we track what would that be worth, and what do we expect them to be able to harvest if they did. and then we track what they actually sold to the market, and then we go back and we try and work out. So because we have field workers who are visiting these growing sites weekly, not all of them, but over the course of the month, all of them, and they're seeing what was harvested, and we find that there's obviously a big disparity between what one would expect, what's actually the value of what's being harvested, whether it's for own consumption or donation or sale. And we've identified there's certain signals in that we need to pay a little more attention to. So when seedlings arrive, whether they're donated or they're purchased, if they're not in the ground in less than 2 weeks, then the failure rate is 5 times higher more than that. So there's a 50% loss of production from the sites that don't get their seedlings in the ground compared to those who do. So we know that we need to, first of all, share that with the farmers and say, when you get seedlings, make a plan, make sure they get in the ground. Even if you do nothing else different, you'll have a much better outcome from the same amount of effort than if you just let it sit. And secondly, we need to go around and check and come up with ways for them to get those kinds of things in the ground. So we're seeing on average across all the farms about a 49% disparity between what we would have expected in terms of that, or what the potential is and what they're actually getting. And so the farmers overall are losing half the value of what they could be getting from exactly the same effort. And helping them recognize that and working with them to intervene there, those are the kinds of things we pay attention to rather than how much they sell.
And then you're online.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I was just curious to understand a bit better what helped you grow, because in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that you started from just simply having a garden down the street. And then I'm curious to understand the factors that allowed you to scale up. Because even in the neighborhood I'm currently living at, there's kind of a guerrilla farming happening, as what they call it. But I find that one of the biggest challenges is how understanding what resources one can look at to scale up such an initiative. So your insight is very much appreciated. Thanks.
I can share the story. I don't know how valuable it is to anyone else anywhere else. I think there's a lot of converging factors that made it possible. The first is that in our community where we started the Oronese City Farm, there was an existing neighborhood watch that was willing to back us when we applied to the city of Cape Town to use the land. So we didn't have to set up our own legal entity. We didn't need 3 years of financial statements and all that sort of thing. So that was the first thing, because if you're not formalized, a lot of doors are closed. So guerrilla gardening is in that creative edge between the formal and the informal. But if it stays on the informal and it can't get security of tenure, surety of tenure, and those kinds of things, then, like I said, a lot of those doors for additional support are closed. So not that one can't do it, but one's got to use other means. And then in our case, we stumbled across literally a farmer's market that took off, and we didn't have a business plan. We didn't have a plan. We didn't know a thing about running markets. And we had a tiger by the tail, and it was paying the bills. So we could carry on. And we had people who were willing to hold on to that tail and ride it through, which is another thing that I think is anomalous, that people were willing to kind of transition their work, their income, all the rest of it, to ride with that to the point where it was able to become a different kind of a thing. We could make the market its own formal entity. We first turned it into a PTY Limited that was wholly owned by a nonprofit company because it was getting us into trouble with the tax authorities. And here we are, a nonprofit, and we're earning too much money, and we have to pay VAT on every donation we receive. That's crazy. So, we had to navigate all of that. And in our community, we had people who were willing to come on board and become board members of the nonprofit company who were lawyers and who were accountants and who were advocates and so on. So all of this social capital in the community where we lived played a big role, and they were willing to do that. And as neighbors, we kind of either knew each other or knew of each other and could twist arms and get them involved. So those are other aspects, and the advantages of being in a privileged community that carry through. And then the timing for me in my role was such that I was in a position personally and with my family financially and my personal motivations, the transition from my other work to make this my full-time work, bringing on the institutional memory of being a volunteer and helping it all happen. So I'm not sure that's necessary, but it made it a lot easier. And there's been continuity for 10 years, which has also made a big difference. So if you think about the maturity cycle of a startup conventional business, you go through these times where things are all going to fall apart, but it's about grit and persistence and determination to see it through. And eventually you find a stable place, or you give up, but you find a stable place. And I think that's where we got to just as the pandemic was hitting. And then the pandemic was one of the best things for our organization because it focused attention on the communities and the issues that we work in. So ironically, we were looking for food security and we could help because we were involved in communities and new community kitchens. And we got one of the, what are they called? The grants at the city of Cape Town. We worked with Ward 55 on supporting community kitchens. I believe I've forgotten the name of them. But the core of our work is not in food security, but people were so interested in food growing and the rest of it. And we have audited financials and we have a board and AGMs and board meetings and minutes and funding and employees and contracts and insurance, and we are safe hands. And so that formality allowed us to attract millions of rand of funding over a couple of years that enabled us to do this. So I don't know that it's a template for anything, but it's how we went from being a bunch of volunteers with a project down the road on city land for no income. Now we employ, I think, 12 people and have grants where we work all across Africa and run the food dialogue, which reaches 50 million. And so it's crazy, actually, what's happened. But that switch happened through the pandemic. And now we're operating on a very different platform.
Yeah, thank you for that.
My pleasure. And I'm happy to talk more about that. I've got like a PhD in what not to do and starting up a nonprofit.
Okay, sounds good. Maybe I'll reach out. Thank you.
We'll take one more question.
Hey folks, sorry, maybe just a comment on my side. Thank you, Kurt. Brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Can you just share details of the workshop on the 14th of September?
So it's not an open event. But
Okay.
if you send me an email and let me know kind of what your kind of interest is, then we may be able to make a plan. We will be recording on video the entire proceedings, and we'll make it all available. And all the presentations associated. I can tell you the structure of it is really to have the Agrihubs introduce themselves to one another. Okay. So we're facilitating it's their event. It's the Agrihubs and the farmers. So we do have some of our funders and partners who will be there observing, but the master classes are being taught by the Agrihubs to one another. And so it's that sort of an approach. So we want to share what comes through, but it's not a fishbowl for kind of outsiders to come and watch. It's a gathering of the collective.
Okay, thank you. Duly noted.
Thank you.
Kurt, go.
Yes, I'm available. And I'm happy to stay if you want to let people go.
Yes,
however you want to do it.
To get running. But I think we've come to the end of the program. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.